80-year-old Arthur Greaves, a reclusive widower, shocks the small town of Ashton when he spends his entire life savings, his pension, on what a traveling preacher calls a golden ticket to heaven. Promised eternal bliss, Arthur's faith in this bizarre purchase is unshakable. But when his health declines and a mysterious stranger arrives in town with secrets about the preacher, the truth behind the ticket unfolds in a way no one, especially Arthur, ever expected. Arthur Greaves had always been a creature of routine. Every morning he woke at precisely 6 a.m., brewed a pot of coffee, and sat by the window overlooking the quiet street of Elm Lane. His house, a weathered structure that had stood for over 50 years, was a testament to his life of quiet perseverance. His wife, Martha, had passed away a decade ago, leaving Arthur with nothing but memories and the faint scent of lavender that lingered in their shared bedroom. His days were monotonous, filled with regret, longing, and the endless hum of passing time. One afternoon, as Arthur walked to the local grocery store to pick up his weekly essentials, he noticed a commotion at the town square. A crowd had gathered around a brightly colored tent that seemed to have appeared overnight. Its bold red and gold stripes stood out against the drab surroundings of the small town. Curiosity piqued, Arthur approached the scene. A man, dressed in a sharp white suit with golden accents, stood on a makeshift stage. His voice boomed with charisma as he spoke, drawing the attention of everyone in the vicinity. "Ladies and gentlemen of Ashton," the man proclaimed, arms stretched wide, "I bring you a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a chance to secure your place in the kingdom of heaven." The crowd murmured with intrigue and skepticism. The man introduced himself as Ezekiel Harper, a preacher traveling from town to spread the word of God. He spoke passionately about salvation and the afterlife, painting a vivid picture of eternal bliss. His words, almost musical in their rhythm, held the crowd captive. "But how?" someone in the crowd asked. "How can we guarantee this?" Ezekiel smiled, reaching into a briefcase and pulling out what appeared to be a shimmering golden card. "This," he said, holding it aloft, "is your golden ticket to heaven, a sacred item blessed by the divine. With this, you can ensure your place in paradise." The crowd gasped, though some chuckled nervously, assuming it was some elaborate joke. Ezekiel went on to explain that the tickets were limited, and each one came at a price, one's life savings. It was a symbolic gesture, he claimed, to show one's true faith and devotion. Arthur stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart pounding. The words struck a chord deep within him. For years he had carried the weight of guilt over his failings as a husband, regrets over arguments left unresolved, and the burden of a lonely existence. The thought of securing his place in heaven, where he might one day reunite with Martha, was a beacon of hope he hadn't realized he needed. As the crowd began to disperse, Arthur lingered, watching as others either dismissed the preacher or approached him with cautious curiosity. Among the onlookers was Emily Thorne, a young nurse who had always been kind to Arthur. She noticed the intense look on his face and walked over. "Don't tell me you're buying into this," she said, her tone tinged with concern. Arthur shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "I don't know, Emily. Maybe he's on to something." Emily sighed. "Arthur, it's a scam. It has to be. No one can sell salvation." Arthur nodded but remained silent, his mind racing. That night, he couldn't sleep. Ezekiel's words played on a loop in his head, and the image of the golden ticket burned into his memory. He thought of Martha, of the arguments they had over his stubbornness, and of the nights she spent crying alone when he worked too late. If this ticket could guarantee forgiveness and a reunion with her, wasn't it worth the price? The following morning, Arthur made his decision. He dressed in his best suit and withdrew his entire pension from the bank, a sum he had carefully saved over decades. The teller raised an eyebrow but said nothing as Arthur collected the cash. With trembling hands, he approached the tent and handed over the money to Ezekiel, who smiled warmly and placed the golden ticket in Arthur's hands. "You've made the right choice, my friend. Ezekiel said, his voice soothing and confident. "Your faith will be rewarded." Arthur clutched the ticket tightly, feeling a mix of elation and trepidation. As he walked back home, the weight of his decision settled over him. He avoided Emily's house, knowing she would disapprove, and instead locked himself inside, staring at the ticket as if it held all the answers he had ever sought. But as the days passed, Arthur began to notice changes in himself. He felt lighter, as though a great burden had been lifted. His neighbors noticed, too, commenting on the newfound spring in his step. Yet, beneath the surface, doubt lingered. Had he truly secured his place in heaven, or had he been duped by a masterful con artist? The town buzzed with gossip about Arthur's purchase. Some ridiculed him, while others admired his faith. Even Doug Wilkins, the town's resident cynic, couldn't help but express a begrudging respect for Arthur's conviction. Still, not everyone was convinced. Emily continued to watch over Arthur, determined to uncover the truth about Ezekiel Harper and his so-called golden ticket to heaven. Little did she know, the events that were about to unfold would shake the entire town of Ashton to its core. The town of Ashton was buzzing with chatter about Ezekiel Harper and his golden tickets. While some dismissed the preacher as a con man, others were intrigued by the possibility of securing their place in heaven. Arthur Greaves, now the proud owner of one of these tickets, found himself at the center of the conversation. His neighbors whispered behind closed doors, and shopkeepers watched him with a mixture of pity and fascination. Emily Thorne couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. She had always been protective of Arthur, ever since she started working as a nurse at the local clinic. He was like a father figure to her, and the thought of him being swindled out of his life savings made her blood boil. Determined to get to the bottom of the situation, she decided to do some digging. Her first stop was the tent in the town square. As she approached, she noticed Ezekiel speaking to a group of townsfolk, his voice smooth and persuasive. His charm was undeniable, but Emily saw through the veneer. She waited until the crowd dispersed before stepping forward. "Mr. Harper," she said, her tone firm but polite. "May I have a word?" Ezekiel turned to her, his smile as radiant as ever. "Of course, young lady. How can I assist you?" Emily hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I'm curious about these tickets you're selling. What makes them so special?" Ezekiel's eyes sparkled with amusement. "Ah, the skepticism of youth. The golden ticket is not just a piece of paper, my dear. It is a symbol of faith, a tangible sign of one's commitment to the divine. Those who possess it are assured a place in paradise." "But how can you guarantee that?" Emily pressed. "What proof do you have?" Ezekiel chuckled softly. "Faith, my dear, is not about proof. It is about belief. Those who truly have faith do not need evidence." Frustrated by his evasive answers, Emily decided to change tactics. "And what happens to the money people pay for these tickets? Where does it go?" Ezekiel's smile didn't falter. "It goes to the Lord's work, of course, to spread His word and bring salvation to as many as possible." Emily knew she wouldn't get any straight answers from him. She left the tent feeling even more determined to uncover the truth. That evening, she sat at her desk, poring over her laptop. She searched for any information she could find about Ezekiel Harper. It wasn't long before she stumbled upon reports from other towns he had visited. The stories were eerily similar. People sold everything they owned to buy his golden tickets, only for Ezekiel to disappear shortly after. Her heart sank as she realized the magnitude of the deception. Arthur wasn't just being scammed, he was being exploited in the cruelest way possible. Emily knew she had to act quickly. She decided to confront Arthur the next day. Meanwhile, Arthur was grappling with his own doubts. At first, owning the golden ticket had filled him with a sense of peace. He felt lighter, as though a great burden had been lifted from his shoulders. But as the days passed, cracks began to form in his conviction. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One night, he had a vivid dream of Martha. She stood at the foot of their bed, her expression soft but filled with concern. "Arthur," she said gently, "what are you doing?" "I'm trying to make things right," he replied, his voice trembling. Martha shook her head. "You can't buy your way into heaven. You know that." Arthur woke with a start, his heart pounding. The dream left him shaken, but he dismissed it as his mind playing tricks on him. He clung to the belief that the ticket was his path to redemption. The next morning, Emily arrived at his house, her expression serious. "Arthur, we need to talk," she said as he let her in. "What is it, Emily?" he asked, though he already had a sense of what was coming. She sat down across from him, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "I've been looking into Ezekiel Harper. He's a fraud, Arthur. He's done this in other towns. He takes people's money and disappears." Arthur's face hardened. "You don't know that for sure." "I do," Emily insisted. "I found articles, testimonials from other victims. Arthur, he's lying to you." Arthur stood up, his hands shaking. "You don't understand, Emily. This ticket, it's my chance to be with Martha again. It's my chance to make amends." Emily's voice softened. "Arthur, you don't need a ticket to do that. Martha wouldn't want you to waste your life savings on a scam. She'd want you to live your life, to find peace in the time you have left." Arthur turned away, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know what to believe anymore." Emily placed a hand on his arm. "Let me help you, Arthur. Let's figure this out together." Despite her words, Arthur couldn't bring himself to let go of the ticket. It represented more than just salvation. It was his last hope, his lifeline. He clung to it even as doubt gnawed at him. Ezekiel announced he would hold a special ceremony for ticket holders. Emily knew she was running out of time. She reached out to a journalist, hoping to gather more evidence. As she waited for a response, a stranger was about to arrive, someone who could unravel Ezekiel's lies. Ashton woke to an unusually overcast morning. The excitement surrounding Ezekiel Harper's final blessing ceremony loomed large, but there was an undercurrent of unease. Rumors about the preacher's dubious past had begun to circulate, and while many tried to dismiss them, others were starting to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. Emily Thorne was determined to uncover the truth. Her search led her to contact Victor Harris, a journalist who had written about Ezekiel before. She hadn't expected him to show up in Ashton, but there he was, standing on her porch in a weathered trench coat, looking every bit the investigative reporter she had imagined. "Emily Thorne?" he asked, his voice gruff but sincere. "Yes, come in," she replied, stepping aside to let him enter. Her modest home suddenly felt cramped in the presence of his towering, world-weary demeanor. As they sat at her kitchen table, Victor wasted no time. "Ezekiel Harper's a master manipulator," he began. "He preys on faith and desperation, moving from town to town, leaving ruin behind." Emily frowned, her hands tightening around her coffee cup. Why hasn't he been caught? Victor sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Because he's careful. He doesn't stay in one place long enough for anyone to build a case. Victims rarely come forward. They're too ashamed, or still believe his lies. And the money? It's funneled through so many fake names and companies it's like chasing a ghost." Emily's chest tightened. She thought of Arthur, of the others in town who had sacrificed everything to buy those tickets. "We have to stop him," she said firmly. "There has to be a way." Victor nodded, leaning forward. "We need proof, something irrefutable. Ezekiel has a habit of recording his schemes. He's arrogant, almost proud of his ability to deceive. If we can find those recordings, we can expose him." The plan was risky, but Emily knew they had no choice. They spent hours combing through Victor's records, piecing together Ezekiel's pattern of deceit. He had left a trail of devastation in towns much like Ashton: elderly couples who lost their homes, single mothers drained of their savings, and communities torn apart by distrust. Meanwhile, Arthur Greaves sat in his living room, wrestling with doubt. He stared at the golden ticket in his hands, the very thing that had once filled him with hope. Emily's words echoed in his mind, and guilt churned in his stomach. He thought of Martha, of all the times he had let her down, and the way her laughter used to fill their home. That night he dreamt of her again. Her voice was soft, but her expression was serious. "Arthur," she said gently, "you know this isn't right." When he woke, sweat drenched his face. Still, he clung to the ticket. It wasn't just about heaven. It was about redemption. It was about Martha. That evening, Ezekiel held another sermon. The crowd, though smaller than before, listened intently as he wove tales of miracles and salvation. Outside, Emily and Victor hid in the shadows, a small recorder in Victor's hand. "He'll slip up," Victor whispered. "He always does." Toward the end of the sermon, Ezekiel made a chilling statement. "This town has been so generous," he said, his voice dripping with false reverence. "Your faith will fund the Lord's work for years to come." Victor exchanged a glance with Emily. It wasn't a direct confession, but it hinted at the truth. As the crowd dispersed, the two followed Ezekiel back to his trailer. The golden glow of the lights inside cast long shadows across the lawn. "That's where he keeps everything," Victor murmured. "We have to get inside." Emily hesitated but nodded. They waited until the lights dimmed before approaching. Victor picked the lock with ease, and they slipped inside. The trailer's interior was a strange mix of opulence and chaos. Papers scattered across counters, a sleek laptop on the table, and framed photos of Ezekiel with various townsfolk, all smiling and unsuspecting. Emily began sifting through notebooks while Victor worked to bypass the laptop's password. Her stomach turned as she read the notes. Each page detailed Ezekiel's scams, the lives he had destroyed, and the profits he had made. He even ranked his victims, noting who had been the easiest to manipulate. Suddenly, the trailer door creaked open. Ezekiel stood in the doorway, his face a mask of fury. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Victor stepped forward, shielding Emily. "It's over, Harper. We know." Ezekiel's smile was cold, almost amused. "You think you can stop me? You're fools." Before Victor could respond, Ezekiel lunged, scattering the notebooks to the floor. Emily grabbed the laptop and bolted for the door, Victor close behind. Ezekiel's shouts echoed through the night as he gave chase, but the two didn't stop running until they reached Emily's house. Inside, they locked the door and set the laptop on the table, both breathing heavily. Emily's hands trembled as she looked at Victor. "Did we get enough?" she asked, her voice shaking. Victor nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "More than enough," he said, his tone resolute. "We have what we need to expose him." But as they stared at the laptop and the scattered notes they had salvaged, they knew their fight wasn't over. Ezekiel wouldn't give up easily, and the final blessing ceremony was just days away. They had evidence, but now they needed a plan, and they had no idea just how far Ezekiel would go to protect his secrets. The morning in Ashton carried an air of tension that was impossible to ignore. The final blessing ceremony was hours away, and while some townsfolk clung to their faith in Ezekiel Harper, others whispered suspicions of betrayal. The divide in the community was growing deeper, yet no one dared confront it outright. Inside Emily Thorne's home, she and Victor Harris worked tirelessly, finalizing their plan to expose Ezekiel. The laptop they had taken from his trailer now sat open on the kitchen table, displaying folders of incriminating evidence. Victor clicked on a video file titled Operation Salvation, Town 7. The screen flickered to life, revealing Ezekiel seated in his trailer, his expression smug. "It's all about control," he said, his voice laced with arrogance. "You dangle salvation in front of them, and they'll do anything. They'll give you everything they own just for a scrap of hope. Faith is the most powerful tool in the world, and if you know how to wield it..." He leaned back, laughing. Victor paused the video. "This is it," he said. "This is the proof we need." Emily's face was pale, but she nodded. "How do we show this to the town without him stopping us? If he sees this, he'll run before anyone else can." Victor leaned back, thinking. "We need a crowd big enough that he can't escape. The final ceremony is our only chance. We'll show it to everyone there." Emily swallowed hard, the thought of confronting Ezekiel in public filling her with dread. But she knew there was no other way. "Then we'll do it," she said firmly. Meanwhile, Arthur Greaves sat in his living room, staring at the golden ticket on his coffee table. The doubts Emily had planted in his mind had grown into a storm of uncertainty. He wanted so desperately to believe the ticket would reunite him with Martha, but the cracks in Ezekiel's promises were becoming impossible to ignore. That night, Arthur had another dream of Martha. She stood at the foot of their bed, her expression kind but firm. "Arthur," she said softly, "you know this isn't real. You can't buy your way here." Arthur woke with a start. For the first time, he began to consider that the golden ticket might be a worthless piece of paper. The morning of the ceremony arrived, and the town square was transformed. Bright banners flapped in the breeze, and vendors set up stalls, creating a festive air. But beneath the surface, unease lingered. The crowd was noticeably smaller than at Ezekiel's previous sermons, and those who did attend seemed quieter, their expressions guarded. Ezekiel, however, was as charismatic as ever. Dressed in a resplendent gold suit, he moved through the crowd with a radiant smile, shaking hands and offering blessings. But his eyes darted around, searching for signs of trouble. He could sense the shift in the air, the undercurrent of doubt that threatened to unravel everything. Emily and Victor arrived as the ceremony began, slipping into the back of the crowd unnoticed, carrying a portable projector and USB drive with the damning video. Ezekiel's booming voice filled the tent as he began his sermon. "Brothers and sisters," he proclaimed, "today is the day of reckoning. Your faith will be rewarded, your sacrifices sanctified. The gates of heaven await those who believe." Emily's stomach churned as Arthur stepped forward, the golden ticket trembling in his hand. His steps were hesitant, as though weighed down by uncertainty. Victor nudged her. "It's time," he whispered. Taking a deep breath, Emily stepped forward, raising her voice to cut through the murmurs. "Wait," she called out, her voice trembling but firm. "Before anyone moves forward, you all need to see something." The crowd turned, their expressions a mix of confusion and curiosity. Ezekiel's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Emily and Victor at the back of the tent. "What is the meaning of this?" Ezekiel demanded, his voice sharp. Victor stepped forward, holding the projector. "The truth, Mr. Harper. The truth about who you are." Ezekiel's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Victor set up the projector and connected it to the laptop. The screen flickered to life, displaying Ezekiel's recorded confession. Gasps rippled through the crowd as his words filled the air. "It's all about control," Ezekiel's voice echoed. "You dangle salvation in front of them, and they'll do anything. They'll give you everything they own just for a scrap of hope." The tent fell silent as the video played. The townsfolk watched in stunned disbelief, their faces shifting from confusion to anger. Ezekiel's confident facade crumbled as the murmurs grew louder. "This is a lie," Ezekiel shouted, his voice frantic. "They've doctored this to discredit me." But the crowd wasn't convinced. Whispers of betrayal turned to shouts of rage. Arthur stood frozen, the golden ticket slipping from his fingers and fluttering to the ground. He stared at the screen, his heart sinking as the truth he had refused to face came crashing down. "You took everything from us," a woman shouted, her voice trembling with fury. Others joined in, their anger boiling over into a cacophony of accusations. Ezekiel backed away, his eyes darting toward the exit. But before he could make his escape, Doug Wilkins and a group of townsfolk blocked his path. "You're not going anywhere," Doug growled, his fists clenched. Emily stepped forward, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "It's over, Ezekiel. You can't con anyone else." For the first time, Ezekiel looked truly afraid. The chaos inside the tent reached a boiling point as Ezekiel Harper stood cornered, his golden suit shimmering under the lights, now an ironic symbol of his lies. The townsfolk surged toward him, their anger palpable. Emily Thorne watched from the side, her heart pounding. The man who had fooled an entire town was finally unmasked, but the crowd's fury threatened to spiral out of control. "Wait!" Emily shouted, stepping forward. Her voice was steady despite her fear. "I know you're angry, but we can't let this turn into violence. We need to do this the right way." Doug Wilkins, the town's burly mechanic, nodded reluctantly. "She's right," he muttered, though his clenched fist suggested he'd prefer another approach. He turned to Ezekiel, who was now sweating profusely. "You're going to explain yourself." Ezekiel straightened, attempting to regain composure. "This is all a misunderstanding," he began, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "These people have twisted my words to make me look like a villain." Victor Harris, standing beside Emily, stepped forward with a cold expression. "We didn't twist anything, Ezekiel. That video wasn't altered. It's you, in your own words." The crowd murmured, their anger refocusing. Arthur Greaves, standing near the front, remained silent, his golden ticket still on the ground. His face was pale and his hands trembled as he stared at the man he had trusted with everything. "Arthur," Ezekiel said suddenly, his tone desperate, "you've seen what I can do. You felt the power of faith. Tell them this isn't true." Arthur hesitated, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He thought of Martha, of the nights he had spent praying for redemption, and of the dream where she had warned him. Slowly, he shook his head. "You lied to us," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "You made us believe you could give us something you never had the power to offer." Ezekiel's face twisted with frustration. "I gave you hope," he spat. "Without me, where would you be? Lost in your mundane lives, clinging to nothing?" The crowd erupted at his words, their anger reignited. Victor raised his hand to calm them. "This isn't over," he said. "Ezekiel Harper is going to face justice." "But how?" someone shouted. "He'll just slip away like he's done before." "Not this time," Emily said, stepping forward. "We have the evidence. The video, the notebooks, it's all here. We'll hand it over to the authorities. He won't be able to run." Ezekiel's eyes darted around, searching for an escape route, but the townsfolk had formed a barrier around him. Doug crossed his arms, blocking the path. "You're not going anywhere." As the crowd began to disperse, the weight of what had just happened settled over them. Some returned home in silence, grappling with the betrayal, while others stayed behind to help Victor and Emily collect evidence. Arthur remained near the front of the tent, staring at the discarded golden ticket at his feet. Emily approached him cautiously. "Arthur," she said softly, "are you okay?" He didn't answer at first, his gaze fixed on the ticket. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted so badly to believe it was real, that I could see Martha again, that I could make things right." Emily placed a hand on his shoulder. "You don't need a ticket to honor Martha's memory. She wouldn't want you to live with guilt. She'd want you to find peace." Arthur nodded slowly, though tears glistened in his eyes. "I don't know how to move on." "One step at a time," Emily said, "and you're not alone. We'll get through this together." By the time the authorities arrived, Ezekiel had been subdued, his golden suit now crumpled. Victor handed over the evidence, explaining everything. Ezekiel protested, claiming he was the victim of a conspiracy, but his words fell on deaf ears. As he was led away in handcuffs, the townsfolk watched in silence. The man who had promised them salvation was now exposed as a fraud, and the weight of his deception hung heavy in the air. In the days that followed, Ashton began to rebuild. Not just their finances, but their trust in one another. Emily and Victor ensured the victims of Ezekiel's scams were connected with resources. Arthur, though still grieving, began taking small steps toward healing. He volunteered at the church, not for salvation, but to give back. One evening, as the sun set, Arthur visited Martha's grave. He knelt with a bouquet of her favorite flowers. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "but I'll try to make you proud. I'll do better." As he stood, a sense of peace washed over him. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of guilt lift. At Emily's house, Victor prepared to leave Ashton, his work complete. "You did good," he told Emily. "Not everyone would have had the courage to stand up to someone like Ezekiel." Emily smiled faintly. "I couldn't have done it without you." Victor nodded, tipping his hat before heading toward his car. "Take care of them. They'll need someone like you." As the car disappeared, Emily turned back toward the town. The scars Ezekiel had left would take time to heal, but Ashton would recover. They had each other, and that was enough. The aftermath of Ezekiel Harper's downfall left the town of Ashton in a quiet state of reflection. Days turned to weeks, and the golden tickets that had once been symbols of hope now lay discarded in trash bins and forgotten corners. The scars of betrayal ran deep, but so did the resolve of the townsfolk to rebuild their lives. For Arthur Greaves, the journey was particularly challenging. Each morning, he would sit by his kitchen window, staring out at the garden Martha had loved so dearly. The memories of her laughter and the dreams he had foolishly invested in Ezekiel's scam weighed heavily on him. Yet, with Emily Thorne's encouragement, he began to find solace in small acts of kindness. He started volunteering at the community center, helping repair broken furniture and repainting walls, a tangible way to rebuild not just his surroundings, but himself. Emily, too, found herself busier than ever. With Victor Harris gone, she became the de facto leader in helping the community heal. Her work at the clinic extended beyond medicine. She became a confidant for the people, someone they could trust after the chaos Ezekiel had unleashed. The townsfolk, once hesitant to confide in anyone, now turned to her for guidance. One crisp autumn morning, Emily was sorting through a box of donated supplies when Doug Wilkins entered the clinic, his face set in a grim expression. "You need to see this," he said, holding out a newspaper. The headline read, "Conman Ezekiel Harper Escapes Custody." Emily's heart sank as she read the article. According to the report, Ezekiel had vanished during a prison transfer. Authorities believed he had help from accomplices, though his current whereabouts were unknown. "What if he comes back here?" Doug asked, his voice filled with concern. Emily folded the newspaper and placed it on her desk. "If he does, we'll be ready," she said firmly. "But I doubt he'll try. He knows we're not the same town he conned before." Despite her words, the news left a shadow over the day. The possibility of Ezekiel's return lingered in the back of everyone's mind, a reminder of the trust he had shattered. Meanwhile, Arthur found himself at a crossroads. His work at the community center had given him a sense of purpose, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do more. One evening, he sat down with a pen and paper, writing a letter to Victor Harris. In it, he thanked Victor for his role in exposing Ezekiel and asked if there was a way to contribute to Victor's ongoing investigations. "I want to help stop men like Ezekiel," he wrote. "Not just for me, but for everyone he's hurt." Weeks later, Arthur received a response. Victor's letter was brief but encouraging. He invited Arthur to join him on an upcoming project in another town, one where a new con man had begun preying on vulnerable people. For the first time in years, Arthur felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond his grief. Before leaving, Arthur visited Martha's grave one last time. "I don't know where this path will take me," he said, placing a single white rose on the headstone. "But I know I have to try. For you, for me, for everyone." The day of Arthur's departure was bittersweet. Emily saw him off at the bus station, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're doing a good thing," she said, hugging him tightly. "Martha would be proud." As the bus pulled away, Emily stood on the platform watching until it disappeared over the horizon. She felt a pang of sadness, but also a sense of pride. Arthur had found his way, and she knew the town would continue to heal in his absence. Back in Ashton, life began to settle into a new rhythm. The town square, once dominated by Ezekiel's golden tent, was now a bustling hub of activity. The weekly farmers' market flourished, and the community center became a place of gathering and support. Emily often visited the market, her presence a reminder of the resilience that had carried them through the darkest times. Months later, a letter arrived for Emily. It was from Arthur. He wrote about his experiences working with Victor, about the people they had helped and the schemes they had uncovered. "It's not easy," he admitted, "but every time I see someone smile because they've been saved from a con like Ezekiel's, I feel like I'm doing something that matters." The letter ended with a promise. "I'll come back to Ashton one day, and when I do, I hope to see the town thriving. Keep being the light for everyone there." Emily folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. She smiled, knowing that Arthur's journey was far from over, but that he was finally on the path to healing. As the seasons changed, Ashton continued to rebuild. The scars left by Ezekiel Harper faded, replaced by the bonds of a community that had weathered the storm together. And though the memory of the golden tickets lingered, they became a lesson, a reminder of the strength found in truth and unity. In the end, Ezekiel Harper's downfall did more than expose a fraud. It united a town, proving that even in the face of deception, resilience could prevail. And for Arthur, Emily, and the people of Ashton, the future was brighter than it had ever been.